course, it's still the Monday morning conversation on Rise and Shine. We're beaming live from Uyo, the capital city of Akwa Ibom State, Nigeria. We're being joined by a very ace, public affairs analyst and several other caps that he wears. Of course, we'll be digging right into that. Speaking of the person of Segun Sopito, who is principal partner at Woodbridge and Scott Consulting Firm. Of course, he's big on financials, and that's why we'll be, speaking with him this morning, as a financial expert, looking into the budgetary plan of the Tinubu-led administration and some other, financial and economic activities of this particular administration. Good morning, Mr. Shopiton. Good to have you on Rise and Shine.
Thanks for having me.
All right.
Good morning.
How is Lagos this morning?
Well, just Lagos is Lagos, hustle and bustle. The hustle is real.
The hustle is real. Okay, then. So we have quite a number of numbers that are concerning to us as Nigerians this morning. We know that the president is getting ready to present his 2025 budget to the National Assembly. But last week, conversations of him, submitting a proposal for 1.77 trillion naira loan to the National Assembly, which of course literally almost passed unhindered for him to get that particular loan. The concern here is, why are we borrowing 1.77 trillion naira dollars rather, increasing our debt burden as opposed to looking for other ways to generate revenue for the country?
Well, thanks for having me again. It's the question you ask is a mystery that most people that understand how economies are supposed to work are also asking, are trying to unravel. I say that because if you look at the fundamentals, you will realize that we're already in trouble with debt. We're in trouble. We were spending at a point 2 years ago and early 2023, which is last year, we're spending all of the federal government's revenue, all plus some extra, to pay our debt service obligations, 110% at a point. And then when this administration came on board, as a result of subsidy removal and devaluation of the naira, floating of the exchange rate, there were some savings, in naira terms. So that reduced the debt service obligation in percentage from over 100% at a point. It dropped to 97% at a point, and it's trending around 65 to 68% as we speak now. 68% of your revenues is too much to spend on paying back debt obligations, because what that then means is that you have no money to pay your salaries, to pay your overheads, not to talk of to now spend on the desperately needed developmental funding that needs to happen on infrastructure, on social services, and all of that. So if we're already spending 68% of our revenues on paying debt obligations, why are we borrowing more? So that's why I said the question that you ask is a mystery for most Nigerians. I think what I've always said and what I've been saying on all the platforms that I've had the opportunity to speak on is that we have to start thinking differently. The government has to activate the brilliant minds that we have in abundance in this country to find a creative solution to the financing problem that we have, to the revenue problem that we have. Solutions other than to continue to borrow. Adding 1.77 trillion naira to a debt burden that is already at 138 trillion, is terrible. And then when you now think of the fact that in the 2025 budget, we're already talking of an additional 13 trillion. So we're trending at around 160 trillion if we're not careful of debt obligation. That is simply unsustainable. It has to change.
Okay, so the question that comes to the minds of Nigerians at this point is, from the administration of President Bola Tinubu's coming on board 29th of May last year, we talked about the fact that you know, we had begun to save 1 trillion naira, and today Waledun is talking about 20 billion US dollars. The question Nigerians are asking is, if we had that much saved up, why are we still borrowing? Is it that we're saving and then we are not using our savings, but we rather prefer to go borrowing? And this consistent borrowing, what does it mean to the Nigeria's economy? And just to bring to your notice, Elon Musk, one of the world's entrepreneurs, have stated that it is government excess spending that brings about inflation. So in all of this, what is the hope, or what does it mean for the future of Nigeria as a country when we have enough savings and yet we're still borrowing to spend?
The connection between savings and borrowing is a complicated relationship. You know, if I put it that way, when people say what's your relationship status and you say it's complicated, I think that fits very well into describing, you know, this issue that you are talking about. Because indeed, it is very possible for you to owe, but to also try to save. They are not mutually exclusive. And the reason for that is that truly, to be objective and to be fair, we do have to build a buffer for the future. In fact, one of the reasons that we are in this dire situation we are now is that governments before now were not saving. And the savings that we accrued, if you cast your mind back to the time of President Olusegun Obasanjo, you know, the well-known narrative is he left us with $60 billion in reserves. And then all of that got frittered away to the point where we're down to about 23 billion at a point. And now it's being shored up again. We're getting back to the $40 billion threshold in terms of foreign reserves. There are other countries around the world that have the kind of resources that we have, especially oil resources. Some of them have foreign reserves running into trillions of dollars, not naira, of dollars. So we need to be saving. While saving, should we be borrowing? So the question you are asking is, why are we saving when we're also borrowing? And I think that truly we can save and borrow if the window was available for borrowing, because you know you keep the money. In fact, the more savings you have, the more you can borrow, because the lenders will look at you and find you attractive. They know that you are borrowing not because you don't have money, but you are borrowing because you are trying to be smart with managing your finances. But we as a country are not in that position, because the borrowings that we are getting into, there are two problems. One, our revenue profiles cannot support those borrowings. Two, is that the borrowings do not result in developmental spending that will boost government revenues. So we borrow the monies and they literally disappear. You can't really point to any serious infrastructure project that would account for the volumes of debt that we have. We have 138 trillion naira in debt. Where is the 138 trillion naira in developmental funding, in infrastructure, power supply, roads, you know, waterways? Where are they? You know, so I think that's the problem. So it's not, we can borrow if we're using the money properly and it's resulting in developmental projects. But that is not the case with Nigeria, and I think that is the problem.
So, but in terms of repaying back of debt and loans that have been borrowed by the federal government, the Tinubu-led administration has, you know, lauded itself to have been doing so fairly with repaying back of loans. I mean, we're talking about paying all the way from about over 90% to about 65%. That is the record that we have in public domain as to how much the Tinubu-led administration have done in terms of paying back of loans. So now at 65% and still going to borrow, it's more like now what the common man sees this as, we are in debt, but we're still borrowing to come and pay back. Because when you're borrowing 1.77 trillion naira to shore up a budget, which will now come back to be used at over 50% to pay back debt, the logic does not quite sit well. So my question will be, what other kinds of alternatives should the federal government rather be looking at this time, especially for, you know, since you've you know, credibly explained to us why we should be saving whilst borrowing. But what other windows are available to the federal government as opposed to just borrowing at
All right.
will? Yes.
Yeah. Well, so I think the first thing, if you want to solve a problem, the starting point to solving a problem is acknowledging that you have a problem. And people would always say that if you can identify your problem, that problem is 50% solved already. So unfortunately, that's not our situation. So for me, the first step would be for the government to even admit that we have to stop borrowing. Right now, that's not the case. It's as if, especially foreign debt, is as if it's opium for our government officials, and it's not just this administration. Our governments historically, with the exception of President Obasanjo, who strenuously worked towards paying down every single dime that we owed, almost to the kobo, almost to the last cent. Apart from him, every other administration before him and after him has been borrowing, and it's almost as if they're addicted to it. So the first step is for them to acknowledge that it's not the only way, that we can find other ways to fund government activities outside of foreign debt in particular. So when we admit that, when the government people admit that, when the policymakers, the Minister of Finance, the CBN governor, other ministers in that, the Minister of Budget and Planning, those three in particular, when they come together and they agree that, look, guys, can we not find another way to fund this budget, then we would have started. When the president calls those three people and other associated officials and says, guys, we are not borrowing anymore, then we would have started. So the question would then be, what else can we do? And I would say, where there's a will, there's a way. Sit down in a room, lock the door, throw the key away, and tell them, don't come out of that place until you've got a solution for me on how I'm going to fund this, my 47 trillion naira budget, without borrowing more. Now, what are the things that they can do? One, PPP. We are not using that enough. We saw the government of President Muhammad Buhari try that to a certain degree, but they went about it in the wrong way because they were going into partnerships still based on loans, developmental funding from China. We need to mobilize private capital to fund public projects. And that is very difficult, but it's not impossible. It's difficult because private capital is selfish. It wants profits. And the only reason that they will go into any project is when they see returns on investment for that project. So you have to create public projects that can meet that requirement. The hard work, the hard thinking, the hard structuring, there's a lot of structuring that would have to go into something like that. And government officials are not ready to put in that work. And that's why we are not taking that as an example of a source of funding. Now, there are other potential sources of funding apart from external debt. You can come to the local markets, deepen our capital markets, deepen our money markets by creating, what we'll call esoteric instruments, exotic instruments, to mobilize capital from Nigerians. There are a lot of people in Nigeria that have money and they're looking for credible investments. So people will say that is borrowing. Not necessarily. You can structure instruments that will mobilize funds from Nigerians without those instruments necessarily being debt instruments. They can be equity instruments as well. So there are so many creative things that we can do, but that government people tend not to want to go into because it subjects them to very hard accountability structures and systems that they are unwilling to, to subject themselves to. So there are so many things. That is not the only way. But are we ready to put in the hard work? I think that's the question.
Okay, being ready to put in the hard work, let's go to the area of exports in Nigeria. For a while now, the President Bola Ahmed Tinubu's administration came on board and they're talking about diversifying the Nigeria's economy and moving away from oil. But it seems even the Nigerian Export Promotion Council is not having the kind of funding and the policies that would help. I mean, just not too long ago, we had the Standard Organization of Nigeria talk about the reason why made in Nigerian goods and products are being rejected outside. What can the government do to change the narrative in this perspective? Because like you stated, it can also help apart from, the drawing of funds from private individuals in the country?
Yeah, absolutely. So the what you are basically alluding to is to say, can we shore up our um, forex revenues by shoring up our export ability, our export potential? And I agree with you, but unfortunately, this is a long-term thing. It's not something that is going to happen in 1 year. It's not something that can happen in even 5 years. These are things that serious countries have long-term master plans that they meticulously and faithfully implement until it becomes a reality. So, what are the things that we can do? Just make your economy more productive and more competitive. Right now, no matter what you do as the Export Promotion Council or any other government agency that is trying to promote, the export industry, the fact that the Nigerian economy is not friendly to business, the fact that it is prohibitively expensive to do business in Nigeria compared to all of our neighbors and all our peers already means that we are disadvantaged. So whatever we do, as long as we don't address the power problem to start with, fundamental problem, power, as long as we don't address the transportation problem, road transportation and rail transportation, that will ensure that you can move the factors of production, especially goods and services, across this country cheaply. Rail would crash the cost of transporting goods and services all around the country. Why are we not spending on building a very strong and sound rail network that connects the entire country? As long as we don't deal with those infrastructure problems, whatever we do in terms of trying to project or promote our export industry and raise the viability, raise our foreign forex revenue earning capacity, will fall short because we will not be competitive. Even talking about the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, for example, there are markets available to us now where tariffs will be significantly reduced or non-existent just because of that tariff that we are now a part of, that tariff treaty we're a part of. We can't really take advantage of it because our productive base is not, our economy is not productive. Our economy is expensive to do business in. So we need to fix those fundamentals before we can start talking about the other steps that we can put in place to promote exports. There are so many things that we can do to drive exports, but nobody is going to really bite into those things because when you send your goods and services outside of this country, they can't compete. They can't compete favorably with similar goods and services from other parts of the world, including even, just the West African region. We really can't compete. So we have to start by fixing the fundamentals. There is no shortcut to it.
Okay, so two key things I'm going to lump into one as we wrap up the conversation this morning is, to comparatively look at, the two administrations under the APC government. If you remember in 2015 where, when the APC government rather came into power, they promised the Nigerian people change, and it looks like the change that we have seen successively after 8 years and just 18 months of the APC government is unprecedented negatively, as a lot of Nigerians feel. Because we are looking at the fact that under the Tinubu-led administration, his debt burden has rapidly increased way more than it did under the Buhari-led administration. So how does it look like in one breath? Tinubu seems to be taking care of debt servicing, but yet his debt margin is on the increase. We are talking, an increase of about 49 trillion naira. That's approximately $108 billion in the first quarter, under the Tinubu-led administration. So his numbers widely vary from that of the, Buhari-led administration, as it were. That's point one. What is Tinubu really doing differently? I mean, we are talking about policy reforms and all of the things that they're injecting, which should be helping the economy one way or the other. Now, Yemi Cardoso of the central bank is looking to once again increase interest rate to bolster inflation. Is this going to work?
It's all it's all magical. That's the word I keep using. It's almost like magic. nobody seems to understand what is going on. On the one hand, to talk about the last point you raised, if we increase monetary policy rate to 50%, I tell you it will not stop inflation. Why? The inflation that we have in this country is not driven by money supply problems alone. It's driven by cost. It's a cost-driven inflation. It's the fact that the operating environment, we have all sorts of problems, including and especially security. You know, the inflation is driven mainly by food inflation and then other things, fuel subsidy removal, exchange rate devaluation. You know, so those three things are the things that are driving our inflation. You cannot stop, you can't check inflation driven by those cost pushes by increasing interest rates. It just makes no sense. So I have been saying for the last 4 monetary policy committee meetings, stop increasing MPR. It's not going to moderate inflation, and it hasn't. It's not working. Unfortunately, like you said, the CBN governor is still going to increase the monetary policy rate at the next MPC meeting. Unfortunately, so we just keep doing this dance. The other thing that you talked about, the change that we expected to see and what we're seeing now, I think it's just unfortunate that we have put ourselves in a position where we leapt before we looked. We jumped before we thought. The actions that the Tinubu administration have taken are not necessarily bad in themselves. I have my own very, very unorthodox views about them. But even if you go with the mainstream view that subsidy is the problem, I don't believe that. But let's even go with that. If you are going to take the subsidy out, you can't do it rashly, you can't do it randomly, and you certainly have no business doing it on the first day in office when you have not had meetings with your policy drivers, the civil service that is the bureaucracy that runs government. You just make an announcement because you think that there are some cabals that will not allow you to do it if you don't announce it that way. But you trigger a chain reaction that you cannot control. And that's where we are now. We've triggered a chain reaction, economic chain reaction, that the government is now struggling to put out fires left, right, and center. We've gone about it the wrong way. So the Tinubu administration was supposed to have helped change the change, but they have changed the change, but it's changed for the worse. So the question is that what can we do? Is this administration going to be honest enough to admit that maybe we've made mistakes and we need to course correct a bit? I don't think they will. The IMF, the World Bank, they're speaking from two sides of their mouth. On the one hand, they'll keep reminding us that the policies that we're driving is creating more poverty. But on the other hand, they tell us that we need to continue to sustain it, that in 10 to 15 years' time, they will bear fruit.
Yeah.
My brother and my sister, 10 to 15 years' time, a lot of people will be dead. That is whether from just living their natural courses of life or from the hardship that people are going through right now.
Yeah.
So we can't wait for 10 to 15 years to reap the benefits of government policy. So the government must admit that they've gotten something wrong, and they need to find a different way to make life better for Nigerians.
Wow, thank you so much, Mr. Segun Sopiton, for coming on Rise and Shine. It's been, an elaborate conversation, especially understanding that we can be borrowing and saving at the same time to help our monetary, image globally. Thank you so much for your time on the show this morning.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you so much. Of course, he is the principal partner at Woodbridge consulting firm. Really great conversation looking into the financials of the Tinubu-led administration. But that's the size of the Monday morning conversation on Rise and Shine.
Well, thanks for being a part of it, and we wish you a very blessed week ahead.
Bye-bye for now.